For most of my adult life, I never seriously considered buying a firearm. Not because I was unaware of them, not because I didn't understand why others owned them, but because for me, it just didn't feel necessary. So when I tell you that I purchased my first handgun at the age of 51, it's certainly worth asking, well, what changed? In this episode, I want to talk through how I bought my first firearm. Not just the technical steps alone, but the thinking behind them, the questions that I've asked, the mistakes that I avoided, and those I did not. And why the process mattered just as much as the purchase itself. Because for me, buying a firearm wasn't about crossing a line, it was about stepping carefully into responsibility from the first shot onward. When I decided to buy my first firearm, it wasn't triggered purely by panic. Now, while the calculus in my head dictated that the risks of not having an option to defend myself or my family were too great to not own a gun anymore, I didn't think that I had to get a gun right then and there. So my decision wasn't driven exclusively by headlines and not by social pressure, and certainly not by a sense that I was falling behind in some mythical arms race. It came after years, decades really, of seeing firearms primarily through negative experiences and secondhand narratives and overcoming those. So when the idea resurfaced later in life, I felt an obligation to kind of slow the process down. I didn't want to buy out of fear or panic, and I didn't want to buy out of some sort of identity. And I also needed time to unpack the personal spiritual implications of my decision to purchase a gun. You see, I'm a person who lives my life with the reality that God's got my back. And for some time, I wrestled with the idea of whether purchasing a gun would undercut that belief. So I wanted to understand what I was gaining by owning a firearm, and spiritually, if anything, what was I giving up? Just as important, I needed to know what owning a firearm would require of me, ethically, emotionally, and practically. That meant accepting uncertainty instead of rushing into resolution. Before we talk about the gun itself, I do want to talk a little bit more about mindset. At the time I made this decision, I wasn't trying to become a gun guy. I wasn't planning on competing. I didn't even know what competitions were. I wasn't planning on carrying, and I wasn't trying to build a collection. So I simply needed to ask myself a series of honest questions. What responsibility do I have for my own safety? What skills would I want to be able to employ if things went badly? And am I willing to learn them properly? Through this process, I learned what I didn't know, and that realization was enough for me to slow down. Buying a firearm didn't feel like just buying a mere product like a car. It felt more like assuming a responsibility that I couldn't easily undo. When I finally decided to make a purchase, I chose to go to a local big box gun store. Not because it was the cheapest option, but because I wanted conversation. I wanted to take a look at different firearms and ask questions and observe how I felt in the space. Granted, those things could be done more in a specialized gun store as well. But that overall experience mattered more than I expected. Fortunately, the salesmen with whom I entrusted this important first step were very patient with me, though I still didn't know really what I should be asking. I didn't feel rushed, and I didn't feel pressured, and I didn't feel talked down to. I was upfront about being new and somewhat hesitant to make this first step. And to their credit, they weren't condescending at all, despite the fact that they're around guns all day, every day. And that rapport and understanding shaped the entire interaction. If there's one thing I'd encourage new buyers to do, it's this. Don't pretend to be more experienced than you are. The right environment will meet you exactly where you are. Eventually, I landed on the Springfield Armory Echelon Comp. I won't spend much time on the specifications here. What attracted me most wasn't brand loyalty or trends. Indeed, I'd never heard of Springfield Armory until it became one of the options that I was given for my first purchase. What mattered most was fit, how the firearm felt in my hands, at least as much as I could determine how a gun should feel in my hands. By the way, please note that this firearm and any firearm that I will handle in any video that I'm in will be safe, unload it, and clear. It's not for sale and just here for illustrative and educational purposes only. I also evaluated whether I could manipulate the controls comfortably and whether I felt confident in handling it safely. I wasn't looking for the smallest option or the most powerful one. I was looking for something that I could learn with, something that was manageable, and something that I could grow into rather than fight against. Now, fortunately, the salesman didn't give me a cookie-cutter suggestion as to what my first gun purchase should be. Yes, I'm looking at you, Glock 19. Importantly, they initially answered my questions with the question: what was the intended use case for my gun? Of course, they had to explain what that meant and pretty much make it a multiple choice test. Was I using this for home defense or personal defense or concealed carry? Was I planning on hunting or collection or competition? Those decisions reflected where I was, not where I thought I should be or where they thought I should be. Even so, the process was not perfect and was influenced ever so slightly by the biases and preferences of the salesmen themselves. For instance, one of the guns that I was considering had a manual safety. The salesman strongly advised me to steer clear of guns with the manual safety, as the fractions of a second that it would take to disengage that safety in a use of force scenario could make the difference between life and death. Now, in reality, incorporating the safety or disengaging the safety into your manual of arms will become virtually natural with training. And a year later, the overwhelming majority of the handguns that I own indeed have manual safeties. My Springfield Echelon has a 4.5-inch barrel and is compensated. It's a polymer or plastic striker-fired pistol, which was an excellent platform for me as a first-time gun owner who didn't know that I would ever purchase another gun, let alone become an enthusiast. Now, several things stood out to me about this Echelon. It felt good in my hands. The grip angle made sense to me when I presented for engaging a target. The texture was secure, but not too abrasive. And I could reach the controls mostly without shifting around awkwardly. In my view, the full-size Echelon fit my goal for a strong home defense firearm. And its reputation certainly helped, specifically that the Echelon is the default authorized duty firearm of my local law enforcement agency. Now, though my selection turned out to be an excellent choice for my needs, I did neglect to take one action in the selection process that I believe that every prospective gun owner should do. I didn't take the gun out to a local gun range and rent one for trial purposes. Many ranges have a selection of commonly purchased guns available that you can rent and shoot. Now, it's one thing to hold an unloaded gun in the store and dry fire. It's an entirely different animal to take the gun to the range and fire live ammunition, particularly if you haven't done it before. You'll get a feel for recoil and learn that different guns have different amounts of perceived recoil. You'll disavow yourself of the misconception that I held that a smaller gun may be easier to handle. In fact, I was somewhat lucky, given my failure to take it to a range, that the Echelon worked out for me. One of the great things about it was that it was indeed a full-size handgun and fairly easy to handle once I did start shooting it after I purchased it. You'll learn whether a particular gun will slip around in your hand and whether the grips are large enough for you to get and maintain a proper grip, or alternatively, whether the grips are too large for you to fully grasp the firearm that you're considering. Now, the wonderful thing about being a gun owner in this day and age is that there are so many great options at all different price points for quality, well-made, reliable, and accurate firearms. It's just a matter of learning what works best for you. One part of the purchase process that deserves a brief mention is completing the federal background check paperwork, specifically the ATF Form 4473. For me, filling out that form was another moment where the gravity of the decision became very real. The questions are straightforward, but they're also serious. They require you to affirm, clearly and honestly, that you're legally eligible to own a firearm and that you understand the responsibility involved. I took my time in filling out the form, not because the questions were particularly confusing, but because I wanted to be deliberate. This wasn't paperwork to just rush through. It was part of the process that reinforces that firearm ownership isn't casual or anonymous. I also appreciated that the system exists to slow things down just enough to make sure that this step is intentional. If you're new to the process, my advice is simple. Read carefully, answer honestly, and don't hesitate to ask the dealer questions if something isn't clear. That moment, pen on paper, or filling it out via a computer, felt like a quiet reminder that responsibility begins well before the range. Between initiating the purchase and actually taking possession of the firearm, there was a brief waiting period, about 24 hours, for the background check to clear. I know it's controversial, but I'm actually glad for that, at least in my case. I do understand that there may be circumstances where someone is facing a material threat that requires more immediate protection. That was not the situation that I was facing. In my case, the time for the background check gave me space to reflect and to initiate critical next steps. I knew that I had teenagers at home and I needed to ensure that my firearm was secure and inaccessible to anyone else in the house outside of my control. So, I had time to research and purchase a safe and determine where in the home I would keep it. I knew I wanted to develop and maintain security and comfort with my firearm. So, I immediately enrolled myself and my youngest daughter in a private lesson for safety and proficiency. When I finally picked up my first gun, there wasn't this rush of excitement. It was a bit anticlimactic, but I did feel a sense of gravity. A quiet awareness that this was now a part of my life, that how I handled it from that moment forward would matter. So I went home. I didn't rush to the range and I didn't go around showing it off to all of my friends. I focused on safe storage, gaining some initial familiarity, and preparing myself for the next step, training. That felt like the right order for me. Now, at that point, there was a lot that I didn't know. I didn't know how much training that I would eventually pursue. I didn't know that I would end up competing with firearms. And I didn't know how much my perspective concerning firearms would evolve. But I did know this at that time, that I was willing to learn, slowly if necessary, carefully and responsibly. And that was enough to start. Now, before we wrap up, I would love to hear from you. How did you approach your first firearm purchase? Was it quick or slow? Were you confident or were you overwhelmed? Or are you still going through the process of deciding whether to buy a firearm or which one to purchase? If you're comfortable sharing, your experience might help someone else approach this step more thoughtfully. Looking back, I'm grateful that my first firearm purchase wasn't driven by urgency. It was shaped by a lot of questions and restraint and a willingness to admit uncertainty. Gun ownership didn't start for me with confidence, it started with care. And I've come to believe that how we enter this space often shapes how responsibly we move through it. If you're considering your first purchase or reflecting on one that you've already made, I hope this encourages you to slow down and honor the weight of the decision that you're making. Because responsibility doesn't begin at the range, it begins much, much earlier. Until next time, may God's love continue to cover you from the first shot onward.